we wanted to have a name that both spoke to the visionary aspect of having real systems level change while also being rooted in, hands in the earth work. And so we that's why we paired Utopian and Seed together, because we were like, the seed is real and tangible and a foundational pillar of food and farming systems, but it's not currently working the way we think it needs to work. And so we wanted to have the Utopian Seed Project to speak to the fact that we had a different vision. We weren't just working within the system, we wanted to disrupt and change the system.
Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Chris Smith to the podcast. Chris is the executive director of the Utopian Seed Project, which was the subject of the cover story of the November-December 2023 Growing for Market magazine. I don't think I can put it any better than writer Jane Tanner did in her intro to the piece, where she said, quote, "The Utopian Seed Project is anticipating a less than utopian future as climate changes threaten crops and growing environments. Among the approaches the nonprofit is taking to fortify local food systems in the face of climate change is migrating crops north to adapt as warming temperatures move northward. The project, treating tropical perennials as temperate annuals, so far is succeeding, with taro, chayote, and other tropical crops imported to trial farms in western North Carolina. So we'll make that article public in the show notes if you would like to read and see the pictures about Chris and the Utopian Seed Project. The Utopian Seed Project is also making crosses with many, many different varieties to try and shake up the genetic potential and make sure there are plant varieties with very diverse genetic backgrounds to succeed in a changing future. Again, quoting from the article, another strategy is to produce crops so dense with genetic possibilities that the plants can orient to a wide range of environmental stresses in different regions. While growing for market readers are quite familiar with heirloom crops and practices to protect their characteristics, the Utopian Seed Project is going in the opposite direction, spurring cross-pollination among scores of heirlooms and varieties to produce plants with many parents. A mosh pit of 85 okra varieties in a parent population created the okra Ultracross. In an example of another Ultracross, Utopian Ultracross collard seeds are the result of crossing 21 distinct heirloom collards. The Utopian Seed Project collaborated with the Heirloom Collard Project on the Utopian Ultracross collard. Also, Chris is the author of the book, The Whole Okra, a Seed-to-Stem Celebration, which won a 2020 James Beard Award for History, Research, and Scholarship. Once again, quoting from the article, the book is an absorbing, charming read packed with details for plant geeks and chefs. His writing and editorial skills come into play with Crop Stories, a magazine the Utopian Seed Project took over and that Chris co-edits. Wow, I can't wait to get started. We've got so much interesting stuff to talk about, Chris. So without further ado, Chris, welcome to the Growing for Market podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was a fun introduction. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, it was fun to think about. You've got so many irons in the fire. It sounds like you're just doing so many different things. But even people have hardly gotten a chance to hear you speak yet, but they can probably tell that you are not from the United States. How did you end up in North Carolina? The article says you're a self-educated botanist and breeder, and you're from England, correct? So how did you end up in North Carolina?
Yeah. Started in England, grew up just north of Liverpool, kind of university years in Manchester, and not a particularly exciting story, really. I met my to-be wife. We did a master's in creative writing at Manchester University, and we're in the same class, and then, kind of met and hooked up and bounced around various places for a while, and she's from Columbia, South Carolina, so we eventually decided to settle on this side of the pond and ended in Greenville, South Carolina first, and then bounced up to Asheville, North Carolina. And, that was feels like a long time ago now. That was all happening in 2012. So I've been here just over 10 years. But I guess a fairly simple love story to put me in this place.
Yeah, well, that is the Asheville area is a great area. And I know in the story they said that your brother is a horticulturalist and your mother is a serious gardener. and that they together started a seed company in the UK. How did they end up starting a seed company, and what kind of seed company do they have?
Yeah, good questions. And actually, I didn't give you a heads up on this, so kind of a sad question. My mother died just before Christmas, so it's kind of a little sad to think about the work that she was
Oh,
involved in. But
I'm sorry, Chris.
yeah, she so my mum was a big time home gardener, and so I grew up with a fairly classic British home garden in terms of vegetables and a little greenhouse where we could grow tomatoes and peppers and that kind of stuff. So I was very much exposed to gardening as a child. I have fond memories of we had a huge rhubarb patch and a rhubarb harvest. My brothers and I would help harvest the rhubarb, but really all we wanted to do was cut off the giant rhubarb leaves and run around the garden whacking each other with them. We just had big rhubarb leaf fights. But my mum made like rhubarb jam and rhubarb crumble and all these awesome rhubarb crops. So I all of us, I've got two brothers, older brother and younger brother, and we were all exposed to that kind of gardening life as children. My older brother, it felt like he was born into gardening. We've got pictures of him as a 2, 3 year old watering the plants. He was like doing his own transplants before he turned 10, and we had yard sales in front of our house where he was selling plants that he'd started through his teenage years. He went to university to do horticulture. He now has a large plant nursery where he specializes in xanthodeskias and tulips and other bulbing plants. He's just published a book on tulips in England. So he's the real he's the real gardener and has always been that way in my eyes. And as he developed his nursery, my mom started kind of working for him, and they had this seed company, which is actually more of a buy and sell seed company. They buy seeds wholesale, put them in packages, sell them on. Fairly standard model in the seed industry. So that while he's an extremely talented horticulturist and grows a whole bunch of stuff and has, best in show at Chelsea and all that sort of stuff, the seed company aspect of it is very different to the seed work I do. And when we talk about seeds, we're in very different seed worlds, even though I always consider him as like the person that has the horticultural kind of skills and has done since probably the age of 3. So when I came back into it, I think of my farming, growing life as more of my American life, because I really, as a child, I went in the opposite direction to my brother. I was like, our rain barrel was like too close to the ground and you couldn't get the watering can underneath it without spilling water everywhere. And I was always asked to water the hanging baskets, and I've always been short. And so I was like watering hanging baskets with a watering can that was a pain to fill, and it would just dribble down my arm and soak my head. And I'd be like, why the hell has my mom got so many hanging baskets that need to be watered all the time? So in general, I was like, gardening sucks and this is just work. And when I kind of went to university and left home, I guess I didn't engage in gardening or growing anything for a good 10 years. I went on a different circuitous path. And it wasn't until I came to America that I circled back to my gardening roots and actually started diving into that world and actually found that even though I didn't embrace it as a child, I had that kind of like childhood learning by osmosis type of experience, and found that when I actually started diving into growing things and the world of food and farming, then I knew more than I realized, and it was a fairly easy path. So the last 10 years has been a super fun kind of form of reconnection in a different world.
That is really cool that it sounds like it came full circle for you. So I got to ask about the okra. How much okra did you grow in your garden in Liverpool?
Well, again, I wasn't growing in Liverpool. So, but if you're talking about my mum's garden, then absolutely no okra. In fact, my mum did not like okra, didn't even know what okra was until I started growing it in America. I didn't know what okra was until I came to America. So, yeah, okra in England, not really a thing. I guess there's a large Indian population, and we have a lot of really good, Indian restaurants. And I'm sure okra has to be in some of those dishes, as bindi, masala. It's got to be there. I just didn't recognize it when I was growing up and eating those foods, and certainly my family didn't either. I'm thinking you could grow it in the south of England, certainly as it's warming, but the north of England, we can't grow tomatoes outside. We can't really grow peppers outside. I've sent, they don't. My brother tried growing sweet potatoes, and they couldn't grow sweet potatoes. So there's just, I think it's just a little bit too cool, and the nighttime lows are too cold during the summer to really successfully grow okra in England. So it might be one of the reasons I never go back.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. I mean, that was kind of a trick question. I was going to be really surprised if you said that you grew any okra. Or, I get it. Yeah, it was your mom's garden. I think you said north of Liverpool. I realize it's not Liverpool proper, but it sounds like you're outside of Liverpool.
Yeah, I know we're going to get into the Ultracrosses, but I would, if I do move back to England, I would definitely take those seeds with me, and I would try to regionally adapt okra to Northern England, which would be a really fun project, probably a really challenging project, but it would be pretty fun to try and have an okra patch in Liverpool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why I'm interested in okra, because it's I think of it as kind of a neglected crop. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people in the USA where you could grow okra probably in most parts of the country who don't even know what okra is, right? And so like I grew up in Virginia, and I didn't even have a ton of exposure to okra until later on. And I do like it now, and I've grown it on farms, and we've grown it ourselves and everything. But it's interesting to me that you wrote a whole book about okra, just because it is kind of a neglected crop. How did you get so interested in okra that you wanted to write a whole book about it?
Yeah. In some ways, the reason I wrote the book was because I felt it was a neglected crop. So I first came to America 2012, moved to Asheville 2013, had the opportunity to have my own garden in 2013. And I was kind of like super excited to be living in a place where it was warm throughout the summer and I could grow all these things. And I remember phoning up my mom and saying, almost like teasingly, like, I can grow peanuts, I can grow sweet potatoes, I don't need a greenhouse to grow peppers and tomatoes. Like, just all these things I was going to grow in my first garden, I was like just super excited about. And okra was one of those things that was included in this mix of things that I didn't have experience with. And while all those things are true in the South, that like we've just got a great, like the right amount of heat for growing all these things, beautiful amount of sun, good amount of rainfall, we're in a really good growing place. I remember planting that first garden and naively going through that first summer, and as well as perfect growing conditions, you also have like perfect conditions for like every single type of fungal, pathogen, bacterial, pest, everything like just like came in on that garden. Like in America, raccoons, possums, like deer that seemed just crazily aggressive. I don't know, like everything wanted to eat that garden and destroy it. And actually everything did eat that garden and destroy it. So like by midsummer, I was foolish enough to try and grow some brassicas, and there was like cabbage moths and harlequin bugs and just blights on tomatoes, mildew on the squash. Everything was just decimated. So my like boastful beginning of the season turned into like just a pitiful, disastrous garden. And that was true for everything in that garden apart from the okra. And the okra I'd like just by chance had planted next to, we were renting at the time, and there was a balcony, and I'd planted it next to the balcony. And towards the end of the season, I had to be on the balcony to be harvesting okra from these like 12, 13, 14 foot high stalks. And it was just this plant that I didn't really have a concept of, but has beautiful hibiscus-like flowers, big lush green leaves, impressive tall stalks. And then as I was harvesting the okra and not knowing what to do with it and just looking up recipes, I was just like, there's so much to do this like ingredients, I guess. And again, because I wasn't like trapped within a kind of a stereotypical cuisine that locked me into like just either doing fried okra or gumbos, which I love both of those, but I feel like I almost like had a childlike innocence around growing this crop, and I was really experiencing it for the first time. And so I was looking at, okra is obviously an African origin crop, and there's just like a plethora of things to do with okra that have like African roots across the whole continent. You know, there's a West African traditions, there's East African traditions. There's just so many recipes to go out from Africa, and then Asian dishes, South American dishes, Central American dishes. There's just so many different things to do with okra, and I was just like enamored and fascinated by this plant that produced so well and was so delicious. And I took that enthusiasm because I did a lot of with my work. I was doing a lot of agricultural conferences at the time, and I would bump into people and we just chat, and I'd tell people how excited I was about okra and how great I thought okra was. And I think at least 50% of the people I chatted to, their reaction was like, ooh, okra, it's slimy, I hate it, it's da-da-da. You know, all the cultural tropes around okra was negative. And I was like, what's going on? Like, what is wrong with you people? This plant is amazing. I didn't have to water it. I didn't have to fertilize it. It's just like a producer, and it's delicious, and you guys hate it because it's a little bit slimy. I kind of reacted to that by wanting to kind of champion okra a little bit. I was like, okay, if you're going to come at me with that, then I'm going to tell you that, you know, the nutritional profile of the pods or the leaves are edible, and or the seeds do this. And so I started just doing more and more research into like trying to prove my point that okra was the best. And that kind of led into me doing a lot of presentations on okra, and then writing a book on okra, and continuing to be a fan of okra.
Good for you. I like okra too. And if you think about the standard diet that people are eating, you're probably familiar with this acronym. You know, we call it the SAD, the Standard American Diet. It is not very conducive to very much variation. And there are so many different ways that you can prepare okra. Unfortunately, the diet that the average American is eating these days is not very good for them, and it's not has very much variety either. So, all right, I got to ask, what is your favorite way, or a couple favorite ways to eat okra? I wouldn't be surprised if you had a couple ways, having written a whole book about it.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge, right? Is like favorites change over time, but I haven't found a way that I don't like to eat okra. It really is, you know, every time I find a new way, it seems to be a good way. One of the ways that I use it the most, I have 2 young children in okra picking time. There's a lot of okra kicking around, so not a lot of time, but a lot of okra. My kind of go-to okra recipe would be just like simply to slice it lengthways, a little bit of oil and salt, roast it in the oven on a fairly high heat for a short amount of time, and it kind of goes a little bit browned, maybe a little bit charred and crispy, and just kind of like simple okra fries that you can put in a big bowl in the middle of the table, and the kids like them and we love them. It uses a lot of okra in a short amount of time. And those things, like, again, as I was kind of like writing this book and traveling around Southern conferences, I would ask that same question of other people, like, what's your favorite way to eat okra? What's your number one okra converter? I'm always looking, like, when people tell me they don't like okra, I'm like, but you just haven't had it right. And these okra fries are the way to convert the most people to okra, because they're just like, they're crunchy. You still got a little bit of that freshness of the okra. But that browning of them almost brings out some of the sweetness of the okra as well. And there's not much of a slime issue. You can squeeze a little bit of lime on it, and that kind of just takes it to the next level. It's just delicious, quick, easy. If you don't like okra, try it that way, and then we'll talk some more. I am a big fan of gumbos, I think, or okra soup and gumbos that have okra in it. Just that if people don't like the slime, then think of it as like the silkiness in a soup that makes a soup really, really good comes from that slime. And so I rarely make a soup that I don't put a handful of okra in, because it just adds a glossy thickening that is absolutely delicious. And I'm a big fan of drying okra. Again, it's like a super producer in summer, and then we go through winter and there's no okra, and that's pretty sad. So I slice and dry a lot of okra, and then I got these jars of okra rings all dried down. And it's crazy because about 2 pounds of okra goes down to about 4 ounces of dried okra. So that's like a massive reduction. Most of that's just water, right? It's all dehydrated up. And so I got these little super concentrated okra rings that when you throw a handful of that dried okra into a soup or a stock, or whatever you're cooking, then it just like reabsorbs and reabsorbs really well. It goes back to like kind of fresh okra texture, but as it reabsorbs, instead of just being water that's diluting the flavor, it's sucking in all the stock or whatever you're cooking. And I'm telling you, a gumbo made with dried okra is so much better than a gumbo made with fresh okra. And so I'm a big fan of my winter okra soup and winter okra gumbos and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that is a great tip, especially for our audience, who I assume is either market farmers or want to be market farmers, in that they may have oversupply if they grow okra from certain months, and being able to dry it is a huge thing and use it later. In fact, I know some people who do similar kind of thing with kale. Like when they have too much kale, they'll dehydrate it and they'll crumble it up. Then you can do the same thing, throw it in soups when you don't have fresh in the wintertime.
Yeah.
And so that's a great way to not let it go to waste, sure, if you do have an oversupply.
Yeah, if you've got the facilities to do that kind of like added value production, then okra definitely lends itself to that, because peak production, certainly in the South, if everyone's growing okra, then the dollar per pound drops pretty low. But if you can harvest it and process it for a winter commodity, then I think people could make good money selling dried okra in the winter. Certainly if they're supplying it with like a soup recipe. I've seen other farmers similar process with drying it down, but you can dry it down. You can oil the okra first and then add any kind of spice mix. People will do this with like cumin and paprika or chili if you want it real spicy. And they'll dry it down with those oils and spices on, and you basically get a chip effectively. So it becomes an okra chip, and they just sell it in little bags. And instead of paying $3 for a pound of okra, you could like be doing a little 2.5 ounce bag of okra chips and selling it for $10 probably. And I've seen a few farmers doing that kind of added value product with okra, which I think is really, really clever.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Just to have a backup strategy for when there's too much. And it's really good for you too, right? I mean, it's going to be a lot better than whatever else chips people are probably eating.
Yeah. If you're doing it that way and drying it, then you're not doing chips in a deep fried setting. So deep frying isn't necessarily the best thing for you, but the okra itself is good for you. That mucilage component is still in the okra when it dries down. It's like those complex chains of polysaccharides, and they don't dehydrate away. It's just the water that's left. And so when you either rehydrate it into a soup or even take a chip, if you were to take that chip and chew on it for a long time, it would develop the slime in your mouth. And so all the health benefits of that sliminess, which is like great for gut health, are still in the okra. So definitely good for you. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm sure we could talk about okra all day long, but I don't want to do that, because I want to make sure and ask you just about the origins of the Utopian Seed Project. Who came up with the idea for the Utopian Seed Project?
Yeah, so I founded the nonprofit about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was working for a local seed company at the time. So I didn't say explicitly, but my American life I think of as my agricultural food farming life. And that happened somewhat serendipitously too, because when I moved to Asheville, I'd been given a $50 gift certificate for a company called So True Seed as a wedding present. And I didn't know anything about this seed company at all. So True Seed is the company, but I had this $50 gift certificate. And so when we moved to Asheville, they had a storefront, and I walked in and they had like 500 packets of these open pollinated heirloom seeds on the walls. And it's just like beautiful pictures in the catalog. And I chatted with them, and they had a lot of missing photographs. And so I had some digital media skills. So I said, if you want to give me a bunch of seeds, I'll grow them and then take photographs and give you the photographs, and we can just do this like simple trade. It took me a while to get a work visa, so I wasn't allowed to work when I first came to America. So I did this work trade. I hope that's not illegal. Maybe anyway. I'm good. So we did this work trade, and I grew these. I grew their crops and took photographs, and it just like was the beginning of a relationship. And about a year after that, when I did have my work visa, then they posted a position for a communications director. And so I applied for that and got that job and was basically doing that communications, community outreach, and just very part-time in the beginning. And that grew into me being their communications and marketing manager. And I worked for them for 7 years. So I was there for quite a long time and did a lot of their education and outreach. And that was really the beginning. Like, I dove headfirst into food and farming in the US. And that job is really what facilitated me to spend every day being able to, like, talking to customers and learning. And I did a lot of writing at the time. Again, went to all the agricultural conferences and just that was my rapid learning curve of just, I read a lot, I watched a lot of videos, I spoke to a lot of people, and it was just I'm really grateful to So True Seed for facilitating that journey. And as part of that, and I think, again, this is part of that childhood, like you come into a new place and you see it with fresh eyes. And so I was looking at the way this seed company was operating within the broader context of the seed industry in the US, and just began thinking that there were things that were missing. And some of that was like local trials to assess whether these varieties were good in this region, work to actually do regional adaptation on these varieties, because most of these seeds were not grown in the Southeast, and we were selling them to a largely Southeast customer base, but they were coming from either big seed houses, and they could be sourcing, or likely were sourcing internationally, or some local seed growers, which were mainly West Coast, Pacific Northwest, maybe Northeast, that they were very much not grown in the Southeast. And so on one hand, I was like preaching this message of regional adaptation and the importance of seed saving and all this sort of stuff. And on the other hand, we were selling seeds that were not from the Southeast and weren't regionally adapted. And that was this kind of internal conflict where I was like, we need to be addressing this specific issue. And So True Seed is a great company, but didn't have the resources, and it wasn't even really their remit to do that work. And so I started speaking with So True Seed about the need to set up a nonprofit that could do the work that I thought the region needed. And that's what led to me setting up this nonprofit, was just kind of like experiencing the industry, seeing what I perceived as problems in the industry and wanting to address them through this work. And So True Seed, for the first year of the nonprofit, I continued to take a full-time salary from So True Seed, but they only asked me to work part-time for So True Seed. And that's what enabled me to spend half my working week setting up the nonprofit. So they really made, in the early days, they made this happen. And I'm again, very grateful to them for allowing me to set up a nonprofit.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is great that they made it happen. Did you come up with the name Utopian Seed Project?
That was a discussion. We went around lots of thoughts and processes, and I think I forget where that came in the brainstorming. I think I was certainly keen on that name and probably came up with that name. And that's the one that certainly floated to the top, and we chose in the end. We had a lot of discussion about using the word utopian. In science fiction, it's got a utopian society isn't necessarily a good thing. It's got some negative connotations for sure, but we wanted to have a name that both spoke to the visionary aspect of having real systems level change, while also being rooted in hands in the earth work. And so we that's why we paired utopian and seed together, because we were like, the seed is real and tangible and a foundational pillar of food and farming systems, but it's not currently working the way we think it needs to work. And so we wanted to have the Utopian Seed Project to speak to the fact that we wanted we had a different vision. We weren't just working within the system. We wanted to disrupt and change the system.
Well, I like it. I mean, it is a bold name, I think. And, I also wondered a little if it were a little bit tongue in cheek, because, in a way, I feel like what you're getting at is that we're all dealing with the potential of a somewhat dystopian future, as far as I think everybody listening to this podcast spends some time outside, and anybody who spent time outside recently, especially over the course of time, has realized that things are changing, and particularly weather's just getting more unpredictable. I mean, that's a huge topic for us right now is all the different ways to deal with the uncertainty, of seasons that used to start and begin at a certain time that now are just much more erratic, right? And so, I mean, I think it's a cool name, but also, I think, like you said, is that people have mixed feelings about utopias, just in that, some people's idea of a utopia would be somebody else's dystopia. But I do think it's a good name, and it's just bold. I was just curious of, how you came up with that.
Before I wrote a book on ochre, I considered myself to be a fiction writer first, and I did a master's in creative writing, and my personal field of fiction is dystopia, and I love reading dystopian novels and writing dystopian fiction. And so I'm sure there must have been a little bit in my brain that was, playing around with the idea of utopia and dystopia, and certainly acknowledging that we are probably heading towards, if not already in, some kind of dystopia. Like you could write novels about our time and people would be like, oh, that's really messed up.
Yes, no doubt. All right. So I'm just curious. Okay, so starting from this part-time, where you were working part-time for So True and part-time on the Utopian Seed Project, what did those, I just want to get an idea of like what those first year or two looked like, and then how the project has progressed to now, right? Because I imagine there's a lot of hands-on. From reading the article, I see where you guys have these trials, and then you're planting these like crossing blocks. I don't even know what to call them. That's what I want to know from you. But where you've got all these different varieties together, making the Ultracrosses and things like that. So can you tell us how the sort of like field work started at Utopian Seed Project, and what point you've gotten to now?
For sure, yeah. So it's really important to us, and has always been important to us, and I think I said this in the naming of the project even, that we were rooted in the field work. We felt like we were going to be saying and suggesting and trying to shift a system, and we needed to be working and speaking from a base of like authenticity, and that we wouldn't have that authenticity if we weren't actually doing the work. There's a lot of educational nonprofits out there and information nonprofits out there, concept driven nonprofits out there, which this is no shade on them, but like we wanted to have the ability to speak from a real solid, I don't want to use the word scientific, but experiential base. And so that just has always made and will always be a case where the field work is really important to us. But at the same time, we didn't just want to be doing field work in a silo and generating data and information that wasn't having real world impact. And so it's a question that I always go back to my board. I feel like I say it all the time. It's like, how do we actually have impact? I have personal skepticism about the capitalist philanthropic nonprofit model, and it wasn't a light decision to set us up as a nonprofit. It was just the best structure that we had to achieve what I wanted to do, which was to do seed work outside of a capitalist incentive. I didn't want to have to be worried about a profit motive. And that it was problems that I'd seen in previous work. And so the nonprofit model is what worked for us at the time. But I didn't just want to be a nonprofit that was just kind of like, generating information to do this kind of like internal feedback loop that you see in some nonprofit world, where they're just existing for the sake of existing, and the work they do continues their existence. I'm like, that's problematic in my mind. So the nonprofit I wanted to make was like, I see a problem, I want to solve the problem. Nonprofit model is the structure I'm going to use to get to that point. Therefore, we've got to have impact. If we don't have impact, then what's the point? And so I'm always coming back to this: how do we have impact? How do we have impact? And so the field work is very important for authenticity, but everything else we do is important for impact. Because if the field work isn't making a difference, then why are we doing the field work? So that's my nonprofit spiel about what we're trying to do, and always coming back to that point. And so the way we usually talk about it is like our systems level change is engaging in this like multi-stakeholder approach. Because when we think about food and farming, or even just a food system, like what is a food system, then really the food system includes absolutely everybody, because everybody eats. So whether you're just a consumer or a farmer or an added value food business, or even a corporate entity or a manufacturer of amendments or a politician, like everybody is involved in this system because everybody eats. And I don't think we really put as much value in this system as we should, because it's like one of the core needs of humanity is food. And so one, we can have huge impact if we only need to like affect small day-to-day decision making things to have like massive ripple effect impact. Like we can vote every 4 years, but we eat every day, right? It's that kind of like adage of making a difference. So when we think about the work we do, then we're very intentional about trying to work with as many of those multi-stakeholders as possible. And that's why we work with chefs and we work with businesses. We still do a lot of writing and video, do a lot of podcasts. Like we're really keen to speak to people, because if we're not linking that work to the people, then again, we're not having impact. So that's kind of part of the work we're doing. Your question was not about that. Your question was like, what was the beginning like? The beginning was interesting because we didn't have any money. All we had was me for 20 hours a week. And I was either going to continue that model and kind of like be half-assed part-timing it to make it work, or I had that 1 year to try and get to a point where I could go full-time on the project and really make a difference. So that first year, I just kind of like ran at it really hard. I had a farmer, Franny's Farm, who let me use part of her field to grow in. So we had access to field. My founding board members are fantastic. And one of them is Jana Fishman, who has kind of, on some ways, been doing a lot of the work that the Utopian Seed Project does anyway, but she does it, she's not as publicly outreachy as the Utopian Seed Project is. So she's got like fantastic access to a lot of germplasm and seeds, incredible amount of knowledge that she's built up over decades. And so in that first year, we basically worked with Jana to take some of the stuff that she'd already been working on, put it into our field trials on Franny's farm, and then just shout about it. Anybody that would listen, every conference that would let me be a presenter, just everything we could do to just get that word out and generate some interest. And I was kind of lucky because I was my book had been published by that time. So I was already kind of had some media interest about the book, certainly with the James Beard Award in 2020. That was the first year that I was full-time on the project. So it was kind of like, it went hand in hand. I think the okra was kind of a proof of concept for the Utopian Seed Project, in that basically with the okra, I just got super excited about okra. I grew a whole bunch of okra and I spoke to a whole bunch of people about okra, and lots of people got excited about okra. And I was like, well, that's an okra shift. Can we do this with all these other crops? So in the beginning, it was really just like running around like a nutcase, growing lots of things and getting excited and sharing them and giving. Like I would turn up at chef stores. One of my board members is Chef Ashley Shante. She used to work at a restaurant. I used to just turn up at the door with like bagfuls of collards and sweet potato greens. And she was like, any chef that would like take stuff off me, I would just keep giving them to them and then just develop relationships that way. And now we have more of a formalized chef network. But in the beginning, it was just like, who the hell's Chris Smith and why he keeps turning up my restaurant with crazy crops? And it was that kind of like just very grassroots, throwing lots of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks type of mentality. And again, I would go back to my board and just say, like, we're very formative right now. So we're just trying lots and lots of different things. And over time, we've developed programs that work and solidified them and have some stability. We're going into year 5 now, and we're feeling pretty good about what we're doing and what's being impactful. But in the beginning, it was just lots of running around and the celebration aspect of what we do is really important to me. So a lot of celebrating food, I think, gets people excited as well.
Yeah. Well, it's important to enjoy it. And I want to ask you more about that field work, but I just want to quickly back up. And you were talking about the problem, and I think it was stated in the article the way that we haven't talked about it specifically today. Am I right that you would say that the issue that you're working on is that there's not a lot of seed being bred and adapted there in the Southeast, and so you're trying to work on that by doing some breeding and selection. I don't know if that's even the right word that you would use, so feel free to correct me or use a different word, but you're basically trying to make varieties that are better adapted for where you are in the Southeast. And the other interesting thing about your work to me is that you're making these Ultracrosses that I would think people almost anywhere could then take, because they have such a broad genetic background, and make selections on those varieties really anywhere in the world, and bring things out of the background genetics that might work in any space. Do I have that right? Is that sort of like the problem, if that you're working on?
Yeah, I maybe should have started with this. I would say the problem that we're working on is an extreme lack of biodiversity, agrobiodiversity in our regional food and farming systems. And so that's the broad scope of our work, is looking at our regional food and farming system, which I kind of define as Western North Carolina. We certainly do work across the Southeast, and then we have some national projects, but I always try and come back to this kind of macro regional food and farming system. And when we look at it, we don't have very much agrobiodiversity, in terms of the foods consumed and the foods grown. And when we don't have very much diversity in a system, then we're prone to collapse in that system when there's stresses to the system. And that stressor could be climate change, it could be supply chain shocks, it could be rising costs of inputs, all these types of things. But a lack of diversity is inherently not very resilient. So our mission would be to, promote, educate, research, encourage people to adopt more agrobiodiversity within the food system so that the food system is more resilient. And if we have a more resilient food system, then we should have food security when we have impacts to that system. Specifically for us, it's climate change. We want food security in a changing climate. And we're going to get to food security in a changing climate if we have more agrobiodiversity, because then the system will be more resilient. And the more chaotic the climate, the more diversity we need to kind of match that chaos, so that we can have adaptive systems that can respond to those changing environmental conditions. So that's what we're doing. Or that's what our mission and our aim is in the big picture scope. The things that you kind of listed as the activities that we're doing are how we get to that point. So our Ultracrosses and their massive genetic base, which we can dig into, are a tool to encourage more biodiversity in food and farming systems. Working with migratory crops to bring in new crops to a system is another way. Encouraging people to grow more types of varieties instead of everyone growing just the same variety from the same seed catalog. That's another way that we can encourage people to bring more biodiversity into the farm system. And the reason why that kind of multi-stakeholder approach is so important is because it's one thing to persuade a farmer to grow something different with good research data, but if they grow it and they can't sell it, then that's a fail. And it's fairly easy to encourage a chef to cook with something different. In fact, they're really excited about cooking with things that are different. But if you get them all excited about a crop, their very next question is going to be, okay, so how do I buy 20 pounds of this every week to put it on my menu? And you're like, oh, bugger, got to go back to the farmer to get the farmer to grow it. So it's this real demand supply issue with a industry that is inherently slow. Agriculture doesn't move fast. Plant breeding, seed breeding doesn't move fast. So it's how do we kind of slowly shift the system so that we can bring in new crops, new varieties, new genetics, more biodiversity in a way that is sustainable and kind of self-promoting within the system and doesn't need the Utopian Seed Project to continue to push something. So that's our challenge. And yeah, the Ultracrosses are the work.
That is a good goal, because one thing that I mentioned when we were chatting before, but we didn't have the mics on, is I used to work for Johnny Selected Seeds, and for a while I worked on broccoli. And one of the things that I was dealing with there is that most of the broccoli that's marketed in North America is bred for coastal California, because that's where most of a very high percentage of the broccoli in the food system in this country is grown, right? So seed companies tend to focus on their biggest customers. Their biggest customers are coastal California. So whether growers know it or not, if they're buying broccoli seed from the mainline seed companies, it's probably broccoli that's been bred with coastal California in mind. And that's why it can be difficult to deal with. It's kind of brittle in that quick temperature changes and things like that will mess it up, will make it bolt or make it develop in a non-marketable way. And so I felt like my job at Johnny's was basically looking at all these broccolis that were developed for California and doing trials on the trial farm here in Maine, and also off-site trials, and basically seeing how these varieties that were bred for somewhere else, which of them could handle other temperatures. But you guys are going one step further and actually breeding new varieties, in your particular bioregion, to actually change the genetics that are available to people, which is a great work to be doing. So getting back to that work, in the article, they talk about how you seem to be employing two broad strategies to adaptation. One of those is moving some crops north. And it seems like those are mostly the perennials. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. So it seems like one of your strategies is to move crops that are typically more tropically adapted or adapted farther south, moving them north, presumably selecting plants that do well here to speed the adaptation of those crops as it warms up, gets warmer farther north. Can you tell us about some of the crops that you're doing that with and how it's going?
Yeah, definitely. We think we've got these broad focus areas, and so we call that focus area tropical perennials grown as temperate annuals. And really, this one plays straight into climate change in that, we know there's a warming climate. You don't have to believe me. There's like IPCC reports written about this, that like farmers that are growing crops now are not going to be able to grow the same crops in the coming years. And that's happening more and more quickly. Maybe that's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but they're not going to be able to grow the same crops.
And they just changed the USDA hardiness zones.
There you go.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't political. They're taking temperature data.
Yeah.
The USDA hardiness zones are based on, like minimum yearly temperatures, and those are changing. And I think most of our audience spends a lot of time outside. I realize that in some areas that's political, and it's just, I don't think you'll have that hard of a time with our audience, and it's just reality.
Yeah. So. I talk about it as reality because it is reality, and people can respond to that however they want, but we have climate change. The world is warming and becoming more chaotic in terms of weather systems, so we can talk more about the seed adaptation and having high genetic diversity for climate adaptiveness. But for the tropicals, we're specifically looking at the fact that we're regionally focused, so we're kind of Western North Carolina. What can we grow here in anticipation of a warming climate? And it's kind of interesting to me because none of these crops are new crops in terms of new culinary crops. Some of them have like real deep histories across the world. Like taro is the one that we're pushing the most at the moment. And taro is like one of the earliest domesticated crops out there. And it's got culinary and cultural history across the tropics. And we find it sold in our local kind of Asian supermarkets, grocery store type of thing. So to some extent, it is already consumed in the United States, not broadly. We come across a lot of people that are like, what's taro? And maybe I should answer that question. Taro is Colocasia esculenta. It grows. It's in the Alcasia family. Most people recognize it as elephant ears. Elephant ears is a landscaping plant that covers a couple of species, so we're specifically talking about one of them. But if you saw it, you might think elephant ears. And it grows an underground corm, which kind of grows like a large potato in terms of its structure and cooking qualities. And then the leaves above ground are also edible. It's an interesting plant because you can't eat it raw. It's got these calcium oxalates that would irritate your throat if you were to eat it raw, but cooking neutralizes them, and then it becomes this crop that is, again, just used across the tropics as a staple starchy carbohydrate type crop that has a bunch of nutritional qualities that are just a good staple food. So it's one of the tropical crops that we've grown, and we've grown a bunch of tropical crops. And usually our question is, can it grow, is question number one. Can it grow in a way that is regionally sustainable? So can we carry some part of it over to the next season, whether that's seed or clonal propagation material, like we do with potatoes and garlic? And then if both those things are true, it's like, then is it agronomic for the farmer? So can a farmer actually grow this and make money? And then kind of like a side-by-side question in terms of this demand-supply conundrum is there demand for it? Usually there's not demand for it, but then that's our work, is to generate demand for this crop that could be agronomically feasible for a local farmer. So that's kind of the process we go through. And in my head, I kind of like have a traffic light system for all of these crops, and some things we grow a lot of things and fail on a lot of things, and that's one of my motivations for being a nonprofit, is I want to have the flexibility to fail. And so we grow a lot of different things, and some things just either don't produce very well, or there's no way to reproduce them locally, so we always have to bring in stock from southern Florida or whatever, which I don't consider to be sustainable. So we've got a lot of things that just don't work. We've got some marginal things where we're like, oh my gosh, this would be so good if we could make it happen. Maybe with some selection work, different varieties, different growing techniques, we could make this work. But then we've got this category green light stuff, which is just like, why the hell aren't we already growing this? Like, this is easy to grow, delicious, storable, has so much potential. It's really silly that we're not already doing this. And so because we're a new nonprofit, right? So we're maintaining some of the amber light stuff. We're always experimenting with stuff that's not failing and just trying new things. But we've got like a handful of crops that are just like, these are good to go. All we really need to do is the work to get farmers the right information and then to start generating demand. And taro falls into that category. It's got similar yields to potatoes, similar storage conditions and longevity to potatoes, and similar culinary uses to potatoes. You can't eat potatoes raw either. So it's really ready-made to drop into that section of the food system, because unlike potatoes, you can grow it with low irrigation and low inputs. And most importantly, because it's a tropical crop, it doesn't have any of the pests or diseases that you see. So it doesn't get any blights. Nothing eats it. Not even deer eat it because of the oxalates in the leaves. So we've got a crop that everything we grow without irrigation or sprays, just because we're trying to kind of got a tough love theory on our selection. We don't expect farmers to do that. But if it works for us in our farm, then it's definitely going to work elsewhere. So yeah, taro is just like one of these crops that we're like just really impressed with. And again, no reason that it shouldn't be grown as part of our regional food system. And so now we're just doing that work, which again is slow. That we currently have a local ice cream company, The Hop, making a taro ice cream. We've worked with a local chef to make a taro donut, which is really popular on Hawaii. We're working with a lot of Asian chefs where it's a big part of their culture to use it. We had a Burmese chef do a chicken and taro stew at one of our events that was delicious. Taro chips are a big thing. So there's like higher level industrial food impacts here where people could be growing high acreage of taro and chipping it. A little like is being done with sweet potatoes in North Carolina. So just lots of just multi-stakeholder outreach, yeah, writing articles, doing videos, the stuff I've already kind of talked about, but hyper focused on taro to try to get to a point, maybe in 5 years' time, where farmers are growing taro, consumers are consuming taro, and really, I hope nobody even remembers that Utopian Seed Project had anything to do with it, because at that point we'll be looking at the next thing, like what's the next marginal crop, what's the next important thing to diversify the food system. I want to get to a point where we've done our work with taro and we don't need to do anything else. So that's an example of the tropical stuff. But there's other ones like yacon or Bolivian sunroot, chayote. Ube is one which is like somewhere between amber and green. It's this beautiful large yam, which is deep purple all the way through, is used in like Filipino dessert making. Just a really awesome, impressive root crop. But currently propagation material is kind of been challenging. We're not getting a real big increase in propagation material, so I think that's going to be a limiting factor. So just doing the work to see which foods can really enter the food system as to be successful for both farmers and consumers.
Yeah, well, it sounds like if you could get varieties of taro that are feasible for growers in North America to grow, it sounds like you said that would be easy to introduce to people, because I've actually never had it, but it's like a starchy, like you said, it's kind of like a potato, right? I mean, it's like one of those starchy vegetables that can be the basis of a lot of different things. Have you seen progress in, what is it, the 4 or 5 years that you've been working on taro? Have you had progress in doing some selection to get varieties that are, I imagine you're looking for cold hardiness? Are there other, I guess if you could just tell us what traits you're going for, if there's anything other than cold hardiness, and if you're making progress on them?
Yeah, I mean, we look at the basic agronomic stuff like yield is really important to us. And so with taro specifically, then one of the things that we're definitely looking at is yield. That's really important to us. With cold hardiness, I assume what you mean by that is that we're able to grow it in kind of subtropical conditions as opposed to tropical conditions. So plants that can grow outside of the tropics. Interestingly, with that one, it's less about the heat and more about the length of the season. So usually our growing season is shorter than the tropical growing season, and a lot of the time people are wanting like a 9-month growing season to get to a harvestable yield. And so we're looking for varieties that produce much sooner. So that's an important thing with us. And I don't know if this has happened in the Northeast, but it certainly happened in the Southeast, where like ginger in the last 10 to 15 years has become like a really feasible crop in a way that it wasn't before. Turmeric also on a longer time frame than sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are a tropical origin crop, perennial in the tropics, that now are grown all throughout North America, and nobody thinks of them as a tropical perennial because they're already a temperate annual. And the further north you go, you're looking for shorter season crops. And so that's exactly the same process. We're just much earlier with the taro in terms of identifying which ones can produce in a shorter season. So this last year, we just did a taro trial. We had 8 different varieties of taro, fairly classic crop trialing where we have different replications of each variety so that we can eliminate field variation. And then we harvested them all and weighed them all in, put them into a database. And we've been doing that for a couple of years now, where we're trying to get ourselves to a point where we can confidently say to a farmer in our region, this is what you should plant, this is how you should treat it, and this is what you can expect. Because we're not, the last thing we want to do is ask a farmer to take a risk. Like, the whole point of our nonprofit is that we take on the risk so that we can make reliable recommendations to a farmer. Now, farming is already risky enough, and there's already enough variables that I'm not about to be the muppet that says to a farmer, you should take on additional risk because of my vision. So we're doing that work up front so that we can get to a point that we recommend with farmers. Now, we do get a lot of farmers reaching out to us that want to take risk. They're like farmers, also, or at least a subset of farmers are interested in putting in experimental crops, or they already have a cultural connection to these crops and they're really excited to try growing them, even if they know that they're not guaranteed to be successful. So we do work with farmers throughout the process, but for a lot of crops, I'm not at a point where I'm broadly saying, hey, you should all grow this. Taro, I feel like we have got to that point. So it's taken us 4 years to get to that point where we've done enough trials and grown enough varieties where we now have a couple of varieties where I could say, you know what, you should put in a couple of hundred row feet of this. You should take it to market, and here are the people that could grow it. And actually, this isn't taro, but another crop, the yacon, which is in the sunflower family and grows kind of sweet potato-like looking tubers, but they're really sweet and crunchy. You can eat these ones raw. The British called it ground apple because it's got the sweetness and the texture of an apple. It's a really awesome crop, also high yielding and easy to grow. So it's another one of those green light crops. This last year, we had a farmer in Black Mountain grow, I think they ended up with about 400 pounds of yacon. And they reached out to us and said, we've had this awesome yacon yield. Can you help us sell it? And we had just done one of our food events where this incredible chef Eric Morris, had made a yacon pie on an apple pie concept, but with yacon instead of apple. And it was such a good pie. It was just it was crunchy and it was sweet. He'd done a purple sweet potato ice cream with our purple sweet potatoes on top. It was just everything about that dish was magical. And everyone loved that yacon pie. So this is where we were able to leverage our network because we have the farmer that's growing it and had a surplus of it. We went back to Chef Eric Morris and we were like, hey, you did this one-off special pie for this event. How'd you feel about putting it on your menu? Because we've got a farmer looking to shift a whole bunch of it. And so his restaurant was totally excited about that. And actually, this has become more of a big thing. We're doing a yacon launch in February with a big event. And they're definitely going to put yacon pie on the menu for this upcoming year. But we're going to do a big celebration about yacon at the same time. And so that those kind of simple connections, I'll probably keep saying this, we've got the supply sorted out. This is part of the demand work, is how do we get people to know more about this crop? And so with this real great chef in town, that will be part of our educational outreach, because now everybody that goes to that restaurant will have a little sign on the table that says yacon pie, here's its origins, here's a little bit about the culture and history of that crop. And hopefully then we'll start seeing it at supermarkets and at the local food co-op. And when people go there, they won't be like, what the hell's yacon? I'm not going to buy that. They'll be like, oh, yacon pie or yacon raisins or yacon syrup and all these other things you can do with yacon. That's part of the dream. That's part of the vision to get these incorporated. So to actually answer your question, yes, we're seeing successes. This work moves slowly, but I feel like only in the last year or two, we're getting to a point where we have these kind of proof of concept stories where we can be like, I know I've been saying for 4 years that this is what we're trying to do. We've actually finally done it with this and this. And I think the more we pick up that narrative, the more people will kind of jump on board and go, okay, we see what's going on here. And this is how we're trying to shift the food system.
Yeah, well, that's great work to be potentially developing new crops for farmers. Or I get they're not new. They've been grown for millennia in other places, but new to farmers in North America, because I've never had yacon. I mean, I think I've heard of it from looking through a plant catalog or something. I've never had taro, but back to your point about having to develop more resilient food systems, it's like one of those crops could end up being really, really important. And so what it sounds to me is like you're trying to develop long day varieties of these crops. Is that right? Because I think a lot of our audience will be familiar with onions, right? How you grow short day onions in the South, there's intermediate day onions in the middle of the United States, and then long day onions in the North, because the bulbing is related to the day length, right? And so it sounds to me like you're doing selection to So that would that work to say you're trying to find develop long day varieties of taro or yacon, or these all these crops that you're working on?
Uh, to some extent, yeah. There's just before I was talking about short season, which I think of as slightly different to long day, but there is, if you were to draw a Venn diagram, there could be some crossover for sure.
Uh-huh.
Like quick maturing would be, what we're initially looking for with the taro is ones that just like produce in a short season. That's my most hoped for goal. But there are some crops, and a lot of them are tropical crops that have this kind of like day length trigger on them where they don't
Mm-hmm.
start either bulbing up or flowering in a certain day length. And a lot of the crops, a lot of other crops that are in our red category are because they have a day length trigger that just means any amount of agronomic intervention, like, it wouldn't matter if I started them in a greenhouse in January and planted them out really early to get a head start on the season. It just wouldn't make a difference because they wouldn't start producing my harvestable crop until a certain environmental factor, the day length, an uncontrollable environmental factor, happen to trigger root production or flowering. And so that's definitely a major barrier to some of the crops that we're working with. We don't have the resources to do the type of breeding work that would allow us to be breeding for day length neutral or long day varieties. That's something that maybe one day, if we get bigger and better resource, then we could engage in that work. But at the moment, if we hit a day length barrier that we can't get around by finding a variety that's already day length neutral, then we're not currently working with that crop. And it wouldn't matter how warm the climate got, or how long the season got, or whether it never frosted. If there's a day length trigger, that kind of like the weather stuff doesn't matter. It's about the rotation of the sun, which we're not going to shift. So for us, I would say we're not really working on the day length problem unless one of our variety trials almost gets lucky and we identify a variety that already has that trait. So really, although I guess that's true for our variety trials, are looking for those either short season ones or ones that are already day length neutral. Let's make this real. Like pigeon peas, gandules, really great Caribbean crop, protein-rich legume, good food culture. They should be a great crop for a warming climate, and they also don't have the same disease and pest pressure as common beans in our region. So you can grow. In fact, we've grown. The first year I grew pigeon peas, it was the most lush legume foliage I'd ever seen. Not a single Mexican bean beetle was defoliating the leaves. There was just nothing on them. It was just like this wall of immaculate green. And it was like that for the entire season. And I never saw a single flower. So there's a crop that on one hand is like, oh my God, we can grow this without a single pesticide, fungicide, anything. It's just like beautiful and vigorous. It's definitely hot enough. Like everything is good about this, apart from it doesn't produce a pigeon pea because it never flowers. So that was just some seeds that a friend had given us. I'd done enough research to think that pigeon peas was something that would be worth looking into. So we did a bit better research the next year and found a northern pigeon pea where a university had already done the work to do the breeding to find a day length neutral pigeon pea. And we grew that one, and that one had the same foliage but started flowering in August, and we were able to get a harvestable crop. So that's more of just like identifying genetics that already exist that work for us. And there's a lot of examples of the tropical crops out there that need that work doing on it. But again, for us, we're unlikely to take that on ourselves. That's like university plant breeding where they can take it to the next level, and we're not quite there yet. I guess another good example, cassava is something that we really want to work with. We have a local Hispanic farming cooperative called Tierra Fertil that are very excited that we're working with cassava, and we're trying to work with them to get cassava because it's a real culturally important crop for them. And it's delicious. Cassava is an amazing crop, but when you buy it in the supermarket, it's like 3-4 inches across, these big roots. When we grow it, it's maybe half an inch across. So it's not agronomically viable to grow the amount of yield we get. A farmer would never make money off it. Maybe a hobby gardener would be interested in it if they really like cassava, but it's a lot of work for not a lot of cassava. So we've tried a lot of different varieties. Nothing's working for us, but we started speaking with NC State, our local land grant university, and they have way more resources, and they've been able to find some varieties that they're describing as short season cassava varieties, or they use the term early bulking varieties. So whether that's a day length trigger or a length of season issue, I'm not entirely sure with cassava, but either way, we're hitting the same problem. Whether it's day length or season length, we don't have enough time to grow cassava with the varieties we've been working with. But hopefully with NC State, we'll be able to identify some varieties that they'll be able to access that we'll be able to produce in our area. And then we'll have a viable cassava crop and be able to get it to Tierra Fertil, who will be able to grow it for their local Hispanic community. And that will be a big win for us if we can get cassava working in this region. But cassava is currently in that kind of amber light category. It's not currently viable, but there's so much potential and existing demand for it that we really, really want to make cassava work. So kind of, yeah, everyone's a little bit different, and we're just troubleshooting whatever barriers we come up against to try and solve those problems to then introduce it into the market.
Cool. Okay. Well, I want to make sure and also talk about some of your Ultracrosses, which is, from my understanding, is the other big prong of your approach to breeding. So, like we were talking about, crossing 85 different okras or 21 different varieties of collards. What is the goal there? I know the article uses the term Ultracrosses. So what is the goal with these Ultracrosses?
Yeah, the Ultracross in some ways feels like the natural evolution. When you start embracing diversity, you're going to end up with the Ultracross, because you talked about the broccoli trials and kind of just fairly classic variety trials to identify varieties that work well in your region. We definitely do that. Like in terms of this regional adaptation question, we do variety trials to see what existing varieties exist and which ones work well for us. We do classic seed selection. So we'll grow a large population of a variety that people already like, and then whichever plants perform well for us, we'll save seeds from the top performing plants to do that regional adaptation. So we can take a standard variety that people like and adapt it to our region so it copes better in low input environments or higher yields in the southeast, or those types of things. So we do that as well. We do classic biparental breeding where we've got two varieties that we really like, and we'll cross one variety with another variety and then just do a very classic breeding project that most people will probably be aware of the process, where you do the cross, you plan out the children, you get a lot of diversity, and you select for the ones that you want. We're definitely doing those types of breeding projects. Actually, as a quick tangent, we're doing that with, we're trying to develop a high okra seed oil variety where dried okra seeds have an oil content that is really delicious and nutritious. It's kind of like the olive oil of the South in my mind, but the yield of the seed is really, really low. It's like 9 to 14, 15% oil. And that's not enough to be, commercially viable. So we took out 20 varieties from the USDA gene bank, where they have a lot of different okra varieties, and they had 20% oil content, which still isn't high enough. So there's not a variety that exists to do what we want it to do. But we crossed all the 20% oil varieties. There were about 14 of them. We crossed them all together, created children. We planted out the children. Then we're actually working with Princeton at the moment to grow out larger population, save the seeds, analyze them for oil content. And our hope is that we're going to find a child that has a higher oil content. So you kind of cross something good with something good to get something better. And the better that we're going for is higher oil content. So we're in the middle of a very classic breeding project to get to a point where we'll have a variety of a higher oil content okra seed. And again, once we get to that point, we get it to farmers. Okra seed oil could become a thing in the South in the next 5 to 10 years. And then all along the way, we're always encouraging not just going towards like a single pinnacle in terms of the variety trials. It's like, what works for you, regional adaptation. And we get to this point where we're like, lots of different varieties, lots of different crops is great for the food system. But if we're really taking this concept of extreme diversity for extreme resilience, then we need to start looking at intra-varietal diversity. And that's when we start seeing, like, how do we have high levels of genetic diversity within a single planting? And hybrids do a lot of great things, but they're genetically fairly uniform. Heirlooms are an interesting counter to hybrids because they're stable and farmers can have some security if they want to save seeds from them. And they also have traits that have arguably been dropped out of some of the modern hybrids in terms of deeper flavor and nutrition. I think that's changing. I think there's been a reshift back towards that kind of consumer marketability and not just shipping and storability. But either way, heirlooms have these like old-timey characteristics that people appreciate. But again, they've been inbred for so long that they're also fairly genetically stagnant. So we don't have a lot of genetic diversity in the two main sources of seeds that a farmer might go for, hybrids or heirlooms. And so the idea with the Ultracross is to like infuse this kind of like radical level of genetic diversity into a single planting. And I think the best way for me to kind of explain the process is the first Ultracross we created was the collared Ultracross. And we were just doing a standard variety trial with 21 different varieties. And we were just looking at the normal stuff, like which ones are yielding well, which ones taste good, which ones look good. We're just looking for basic marketability. And we did all that, and they were growing in the field, and they went into the winter, and we kind of like had got all the data that we wanted and were ignoring them, but they were still growing. And we had this crazy cold spell, which kind of feeds into the climate change, where it was maybe in the 70s and the 80s for a couple of weeks. I think this was in February. We have these kind of like June and February type events where it's like really beautiful and warm. And then within a 24-hour period, it goes from that 80 Fahrenheit and it dropped down to 8 Fahrenheit. There was like a 78 Fahrenheit temperature swing overnight. And plants, generally are fairly good at working with extremes. If it's real cold, they're sometimes okay, really hot, they're okay. But when it shifts from one to the other, then they struggle with that, right? And so I was expecting after that weather event to go to see my collards and just see a field full of just collared mush. But when I turned up at the field, it was more nuanced than that. I had all these 21 varieties in replicated blocks, and it would go like mush, mush, beautiful green, mush, beautiful green. And it was like within each variety, there was some that had gone to epic mush and some that had survived. And that pattern was replicated across the whole field. So there was some survivors in each of the 21 varieties. And it was just when you see like one plant that's meant to be the same variety, one is beautiful and alive as if it hadn't just experienced that crazy temperature swing, and the other is just dead. You can't even see a collared plant anymore. Then, there has to be a genetic difference there. There's no way that, there's not a genetic something. It's not environmental. It's genetic. And so it was kind of a light bulb moment for me where I stood in that field and I was like, holy God, these plants that are alive right now are genetically superior for coping with extreme weather events. And so made the decision to let all those collards like just continue to survive. Any plant that survived that winter was allowed to go to flower and set seed. And because collards are obligate outcrosses, they have to share pollen with a different plant. They can't self-pollinate. then that field basically was just this massive mashup of genetics from all these super tough plants. And we already knew that they were like, there was beautiful diversity in these collards. They were delicious collards because we'd been working with chefs. And now they were extremely cold tolerant. So we had this hyper diverse, genetically diverse plant population that was cold tolerant, beautifully, aesthetically beautiful, and absolutely delicious. And we were basically just posting about it on Instagram to go, this is going to be a real fun breeding project to see where these diverse genetics go. And a friend from ours in Pacific Northwest said, "Oh, it's an Ultracross," and that name just kind of stuck. So we didn't intentionally name it the Ultracross. This friend of ours tagged it that, and we've just been calling it the Ultracross collards since. But technically, it's a composite cross or an evolutionary plant breeding project where you take a high number of parents, mix them all up, and then expose the children of them to environmental conditions to see which ones self-select for survivability. Mm-hmm. The difference that we're doing with these is we're not selecting to a specific narrow goal. We're going to try and maintain a huge amount of genetic diversity in the plant population and just let the environment select for what's important to us, which for the collards is simply just, can they survive our winters, which are getting more and more crazy? And if they can survive the winter and produce a seed crop, then that's our selection. And then we'll continue to look for flavor and aesthetic diversity in there as well. And so what we see is a single packet of seeds with a huge amount of genetic diversity. And that genetic diversity gives this concept of like adaptive capacity, where basically, you said this yourself, this packet of seeds could go anywhere in the country. And if people plant it and allow their own environmental conditions to select for survivors, whether that's pest pressure or personal color preferences or cold temperatures or hot temperatures, whatever it is, there's so much genetic diversity in this packet of collards that the survivors of that planting will rapidly adapt to regional environmental conditions. And so I don't know what the time frame is, but over a handful of years, then these Ultracross collards will become extremely unique to your own growing conditions. And even if you've got very marginal or challenging growing conditions, then this is your best hope of being able to grow in for whatever you need, really. Whatever those challenges are, there should be some genetic combination in these collards that could match those challenges. And so that's the idea of this kind of like radical diversity for extreme climate resilience is really what the Ultracross is all about. Now, I know there's going to be some market farmer questions about uniformity and harvest, but that's a different conversation. Or maybe it's the next conversation. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, yeah, that may be the next question. Actually, I'm wondering, are you hoping to end up with a few varieties that you can tell farmers in Western North Carolina, tell them that like, oh, we've selected some actual varieties out of this huge Ultracross that have like specific traits that make them well adapted to Western North Carolina? Or are you doing it more for the cross itself and saying, here's a very diverse, I guess it's not a variety, it's like a seed lot, pick what you need out of it? Yeah, like what's the end point of this?
For us at present, we are not aiming to develop specific varieties that would meet the standard variety concept, which is distinct, uniform, and stable. These are inherently non-uniform and non-stable. And we don't want to go towards distinct, uniform, and stable, and therefore like a nameable variety. One thing we are doing is kind of like segregating certain lines of this diverse plant population. In the first year, we sent about 500 packets of these collards out. And a lot of the feedback we got was like people were amazed by the purple colors of the collards. So there was a lot of like user feedback on purple collards. And so now we have two Ultracross populations. We have one kind of just general Western North Carolina population, but we also have a purple line where we're maintaining as much diversity as possible while selecting for purple. and and I think that's kind of like this is the ongoing conversation. It's like what can we stabilize while also maintaining as much diversity as possible? Most of the time, plants are totally uniform, and we want to maintain as much diversity as possible because of that resilience component. And I think these will become more and more important. Like hyper uniformity is great if you have hyper uniform conditions in which to grow them. And usually we kind of achieve hyper uniform conditions through a whole lot of environmental modification, whether that's irrigation, pesticides, fertilizers, fungicides, greenhouses, all this kind of infrastructure and externalized inputs basically modifies the environment to make narrow genetics perform in anywhere. That's the current industrial food model. And we're saying, how about we accept the environment that we have, introduce insanely diverse genetics, and allow the seeds to adapt to the environment instead of adapting the environment to the seeds. And that's gonna shake up the system a bit, because we're used to having very uniform products coming out of these very uniform systems. But again, like we said right at the beginning, the more uniform a system, the more prone to collapse, certainly when there's high pressures on that system, climate change, supply, etc. So we know there's going to be more challenging environmental conditions. So therefore, the more climate chaos we have, the more seed diversity we need to be able to adapt to those conditions in real time. And so these ultracross populations are able to do that. The challenge is creating a system or a consumer base or farming practices that can cope with a lack of uniformity. Obviously, large-scale mechanized harvest is going to be something that's not going to work great. We're Western North Carolina focused, where we're in the mountains, and most farmers are small farmers. Most farmers I work with are hand harvesting, and the need for hyper uniformity from a harvesting perspective is less necessary. And so then it becomes consumer expectations, where consumers expect a certain thing. And so now we're like on a re-education campaign to go, well, actually, wouldn't like a pint of okra where every single okra pod is different be more exciting than every single pod being Clemson spineless?
Right.
That's the type of like re-education models that we're working on at the moment with the Ultracross. And so again, this is a visionary project where we're trying to shift the system, and this is one of the systems we think needs to change from hyper uniformity to high diversity, and the Ultracross is just one of the more extreme examples of that. It's not going to work for every farmer. It's not going to work for every market farmer, but I think it's worth asking the question: which crops can I accept high diversity? Maybe it's a lettuce salad crop. Do I need to have a single uniform hybrid, or can I have like every single lettuce looking a little bit different? And actually, would that make a really interesting salad? Is there an added value market opportunity here where we can have diversity and a viable market? And I think those small steps are potentially the way to go. The collards, if you're hand harvesting collards, I think the collared Ultracross is great for a market farmer because there's just a lot of beautiful diversity in there. The okra Ultracross is currently challenging because some of the okra is like 12 feet tall and some of it's 2 feet tall. Some of it's branchy, some of it's not branchy. I probably wouldn't recommend the Ultracross okra as it exists to a market farmer because it would be a pain to harvest. So we're trying to select the okra Ultracross to have uniform height while maintaining high diversity in pod shape and color. So that's the kind of, almost like the tropicals. Everyone's a little bit different, and we're just trying to, respect the needs of the farmer, the needs of the consumers, while holding space for the future need that maybe people don't accept yet, which is climate chaos. So
yeah.
Crop options for a changing climate is kind of like a tagline that we use. Like, how do we have food security in a changing climate? We have to have crop options to suit that changed environment. And the Ultracross and the Tropicals both fill that niche.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I think one thing that growers are noticing is, in addition to just being warmer, the climate is just getting more unpredictable. So we're getting bigger rain events, longer droughts, weather events at times of the year when we really weren't expecting them. So that makes a lot of sense to be trying to build in some more diversity and resilience into the genetics of the plants that we're relying on. Well, I think by this point in the conversation, I think we could talk about this stuff all day long, but we've been talking for a good long time. And I think I've got two questions that actually, now that I'm thinking about them, they're kind of related. And I'm thinking that by this point, a lot of growers might be interested in knowing how they can either get some seeds or participate. Because I know in the article it said that farmers who buy and grow out some of the Ultracrosses can participate in community seed selection projects and receive guidance from Utopian and perhaps one of your seed company collaborators. And then I also know that some of your breeding work is available from some of the companies that you work with. So can we just wrap that all into one question of basically how, if people at this point in the conversation are interested to try some of your varieties or some of the things that you've worked on, how can they access them?
Yeah, so we get that question a lot, and it's important to us that we don't get dragged into being a seed company. So we really try not to. We're not selling our seeds to consumers, but we also recognize that if we're doing this work and promoting these things, that people are going to be interested in and want to access them. So that's kind of like an internal thing that we're working with at the moment, and we're solving on a couple of levels. One, like you say, is when we're doing bigger lots of seeds. Often on the experimental side of things, we do supply seeds to seed companies that then pack them out and sell them. So it's worth, kind of doing a search for Utopian Seed Project along with some of the East Coast seed companies, So True Seed, Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, Ujamaa Seeds, and the Experimental Farm Network are the four bigger ones that we work with. So that's definitely a go-to for some of the varieties. We have the Community Seed Selection Project is something that we've done on and off for a couple of years, and I really like it as a concept. It's quite a big management component, so we actually didn't do it last year, but I think we might relaunch it again this year. So it's worth following along on social media or the website, where we have enough seeds of one thing where we have a question ourselves that could be accelerated by having community engagement. So we did this with an okra variety that we were trying to select to be the palest okra pod possible. And so we'd got to a point ourselves with selection in our own field with just like a couple of hundred plants where we were getting pretty close, but I ended up with about 10 pounds of okra seed. And I thought, well, let's just open it up. So we sent about 300 packets out to people that signed up all over the country and had a kind of a grow along concept where we did monthly videos and we had a Facebook group and people shared their progress. And we just did a community seed selection where we're all selecting. Sorry, fire engine going past. We were all selecting for the same thing. And it was amazing to see. One, it was amazing because people really got into it. Like I've been teaching seed saving for a long time, but it was awesome that these folks were like this objective based seed saving where they were like, seed saving was just a way to get to the end goal, which was to select for a white okra. That really, people that had never saved seeds before were bagging okra flowers and observing their plants every day and looking at micro botanical stuff on the plants. And it was just really fun to see how people engaged on that level. But then they sent their seeds back to me and I mixed all those seeds together and grew them out the following year. And I got it was the best stand of pale okra pods that I'd had. So, and I'd been trying to do this project on my own for 3 or 4 years. And once I opened it up to a huge group, because, we have 250 growers, even if they just planted 20 plants each, that was still way more plants than I could have grown myself. We were suddenly in the thousands of plants to select from instead of just my couple of hundred. So I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do this year with that, but I do love those projects and I'm sure we'll be doing them again. So that's a good way to engage if you're into trialing or experimentation or that type of thing. And then the other thing that we've not talked about, and I know we're running out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time going into this, but just want people to have a heads up about it. We do recognize that we need to get our seeds out to people, and that we don't currently have our own resources to do a whole bunch of seed production. And then we're looking at regional systems and recognizing that there's not very many seed growers in the Southeast. So there's like a bottleneck here where we're trying to promote a whole bunch of diversity, but there's no way to get it out to people because there's no one to grow it regionally. So this last year, my farm manager, Lisa Chen, and myself and then a collaborator, Shelby Johnson, set up an Appalachian Seed Growers Collective, where the basic idea is that we have regional seed growers growing regionally adapted or regionally relevant seeds to supply to regional farmers. So we have this very enclosed regional network. The Utopian Seed Project is doing the work of the regional adaptation to then feed seeds into the Seed Growers Collective that will then grow the seeds to either distribute through seed companies or directly as an actual cooperative economic model to then actually supply local farmers with seeds that are regionally adapted. So that's trying to, again, multi-stakeholder systems level change. It's like, where are the barriers? Why isn't this working? Why aren't we already growing taro? Why don't we have a regional seed system? We don't have any regional seed growers. So we're like, why don't we have any regional seed growers? There's no regional educational opportunities. There's no there's no internships for seed growers. There's no resources in terms of equipment access. And there's some inherent challenges around growing seeds in the Southeast. So we got a grant to buy a box trailer. We filled it full of seed saving equipment. And now we have a mobile seed processing trailer that's accessible to the collective. We have monthly meetings. We have pizza parties. We're trying to create community around regional seed growing that have access to this. And then as a collective, we're trying to make money by growing and selling seeds to regional farmers that have been proven to work well in this region. So that's another way that we're trying to shift this system to being macro regional food system focused and supporting local farmers and local seed. So that's some of the ways that we're trying to get seeds out to people. But again, I think I've said this multiple times now. It is slow work, but slowly we're getting. This year we've sent out more seeds to seed companies than ever before, and I think we're starting to have that impact that I really want. So yeah, just follow along. Opportunities crop up. We're fairly dynamic and small organization, and if something's working, we'll run with it. And if there's something that you really, really, really want to try, then email me. And we're still small enough that I pretty much send seeds to anybody that asks.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That regional seed growers network, I think that's going to have a lot of impact, because I know that if you're growing and processing any amount of seed beyond just a little bit for your own use, that equipment to clean and process seed can be pretty expensive because it's pretty specialized. And so I could see how that would be a stumbling block for people right there. So I think that you were able to get some of that equipment that can be, like you said, on the trailer, so multiple people can use it. That, I think that's going to be a game changer for your regional network right there. That's really cool that you're able to make that available to your network. Well, yeah, that's all very exciting. I think we could go on, but I also think we've taken a lot of your time already this morning. But I just wanted to make sure, is there anything I should have asked you about, or anything else that you'd like to say before we let you go?
Oh, no, like you say, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we are doing a lot of things. So I'm sure there's other things we could talk about. But I would just encourage folks to follow along with what we're doing. We're fairly active on Instagram, so I'd ask people to follow us there, and feel free to reach out and have a conversation. And then we actually got a grant to do a big website redesign, so the website's a little bit out of date, but hopefully in the next 6 months we'll have some really good information there. So if people want to learn more, then just sign up to that email list and stay involved. And again, we're small enough that I enjoy people reaching out and having conversations and geeking out about seeds.
Yes. Yeah, it's been fun. And what is your website?
Utopianseed.org.
Okay. All right, great. Well, there's a couple places where people can track you down. I've definitely enjoyed geeking out on seed with you today, and yeah, and I think I wish you all the best. I mean, you're doing some really interesting work, very important work. So I wish you all the best with your endeavors, and maybe a couple of years we could have you back on the pod and see how things have changed. I'm just fascinated with both the ideas and what you're doing. So I would love to catch up with you again someday.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation today, and best of luck with everything in this new year. And thanks for the conversation.